Insofar as the Bull Leaper fresco depicts entertainment for the gods, it might of course be considered in a certain sense to be religious, and the same thing might be true of the so-called snake goddesses like this one that have been found at Knossos. The handling of dangerous snakes in this fashion might also be thought something that would impress the gods. This is a small figure, just about a foot high, but it's about as big as Minoan sculpture gets. There's no marble on Crete, which may in part account for this, but the complete absence here of any large-scale sculpture in any medium is still a little surprising. There is limestone on Crete, and the Egyptians probably would have covered the island with 50-foot colossi. These are small, just a couple of inches high, gold items in the form of the double axe and a stylized bull's head. Double axes like these have been found by the dozens, if not hundreds, on Mount Ida, one of the supposed birthplaces of Zeus. They seem to have been left there, like vases found in the Kamari's cave, as votive offerings. The bull's head ornaments seem to have been worn as earrings. Seal stones like this have also been found in the vicinity of Knossos. The one at the bottom has a man with an apparently tame lion on it, while the one at the top is more complicated. The figure in the center bears a close relationship to the snake goddess we just saw, but what the fellow at the right is doing is anyone's guess. It looks like he's involved in a life and death struggle with a houseplant. Trees of one kind or another often play a prominent role in ancient religion, and this fellow may have forgotten to water his god, I think. Knossos is only the largest and most interesting of many Minoan sites that have been found on Crete. What was probably the second largest such establishment of the day was at Phaistos, which was connected to Knossos by a paved road 25 miles long. The Italians who did the excavation here claim that since they didn't do large-scale rebuilding like Evans, one gets here a sort of purer archaeological experience. This is called the theatral area here on the assumption that it is suited to some sort of performance. Perhaps, it has been suggested, the bull sport took place here. The latter doesn't look likely to me, however. It doesn't seem large enough, and if people sat on those steps to watch, the ones in the first rows would have been taking their lives in their hands just to be spectators.
The Phaistos disc here is one of the most puzzling things found on Crete. Some, in fact, think it a forgery, and even those who say it's a genuine Minoan or at least ancient artifact hold widely varying opinions about what language, if it is a language, is on it, and what it means. Is it a love poem, a religious text, a grocery list? It's unlikely any general agreement will come soon.
Not far from Phaistos is what Evans referred to as a royal villa at Hagia Triada on the coast. Evans has been accused of using the model of the English monarchy a little too much in his interpretation of Minoan civilization, and he may be guilty of that, but this does have the look of a seaside resort about it that probably only someone like a king could afford. In this picture, you can see one of the staircases at Hagia Triada. They do not look very well worn. They do not look as though they've been used very much. Hans-Georg Wunderlich makes this point about the main palace at Knossos. The staircases there do not look heavily worn. There are possible explanations for this, though. His explanation is that ghosts don't leave footprints, that if it were in fact the palace at Knossos, the presumed palace used as a mortuary, it wouldn't have had that much foot traffic to wear down the staircases. But of course they could have been veneered with something, they could have had carpets over them. There are lots of possible explanations to account for this. One of the most interesting things found at Hagia Triada is this painted limestone sarcophagus. The fact that nothing else really like this has been found on Crete may mean that it was imported. despite the Minoan style of decoration. As we'll see, this style of decoration was in fact to be found throughout the Aegean in the middle of the second millennium. On the other side, the sacrifice of a bull is depicted, while on this side, offerings are apparently being presented to or on behalf of the deceased, who is thought to be the fellow at the right. You can see the blue rosettes here, the presence of which in the decoration of the Queen's room at Knossos made Wunderlich think that it had some funerary function. This is the so-called harvester vase, which was also found at Hagia Triada. It's one of the most animated works to survive from the whole ancient Mediterranean. It looks like these fellows could be singing some Minoan version of hi ho, it's off to work we go. These necklaces were found in a tomb at Fourny, south of Knossos. Again, the blue rosettes are found here among the dead, but it may be that they were just an anniversary present. This is one of the most charming examples of the Minoan jeweler's art. Zeus is said to have been provided with honey by the bees of Mount Ida after he was born here. In about 1500 BC, the island of Thera, also known as Santorini now, blew up in a colossal volcanic cataclysm. It's only about 75 miles north of Knossos, and the late Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos argued that this eruption was the thing that brought an abrupt end to Minoan civilization. On the face of it, this doesn't seem implausible to many. The eruption might have been accompanied by an earthquake that could have knocked down the buildings, and ashfall could have killed the crops, and tidal waves could have wiped out the fleet. Considering that about 100 square miles of the island just disappeared, this was the biggest such event of historical times, far surpassing the eruption of Krakatoa in Indonesia in 1883, which was audible 3,000 miles away and created 50-foot tidal waves that drowned thousands. This is another view of Santorini today, and you can see the island being formed as a result of continuing volcanic activity here. There was an eruption in the 1920s that did considerable damage. Although I can't go into detail about the dating process, most archaeologists now believe that civilization was flourishing at Knossos and other Cretan locations for some 50 years after the eruption. There's no clear evidence the buildings at Knossos were knocked down by an earthquake, or that there was enough ashfall to make agriculture impossible. It's thought likely, however, that any ships in port for hundreds of miles from Thera could well have been destroyed. Since the final explosion was preceded by months of lesser activity, it's conceivable that the fleet was warned, but most do buy the part of Marinatos' theory that argues for the possible destruction of the fleet, if not of the palaces and the civilization itself. The usual view now is that the palaces were destroyed by invaders from the mainland. Perhaps the destruction of the fleet could have made this invasion easier, but 50 years is plenty of time to rebuild. In any case, it was ultimately man, not nature, that wrecked Minoan civilization around 1450. Knossos itself was apparently used as a base by these invaders and survived somewhat longer before it too was destroyed in the 14th century BC. We'll hear about the mainland shortly, but here you see the ruins of the once flourishing town of Akrotiri, actually on the island of Thera, which was buried by the debris of the eruption. It's ironic that the only body buried here now is that of Marinatos himself, who was killed in a fall while supervising the excavations. The original inhabitants had abandoned the place before the final eruption. This is one of the largest archaeological projects currently underway in the Greek world. At the right you can see a 3,500-year-old pot ready to be dug out. At the left in this picture is the restored West House, on the flattened walls of which were found some of the most celebrated works of Minoan Age art. Whether there was any political connection between Thera and Knossos, it's hard to say, but as I mentioned earlier, the style of art associated with Minoan civilization was common throughout much of the Aegean. Here's one of the most beautiful surviving examples from the decoration of the West House, now in the National Museum in Athens. It's certainly imbued with the same grace and elegance that we see in the human figures at Knossos. This picture, also from the West House, gives us the best look we can get at what the Cretan fleet might have been like, although these ships seem fitted out for something more like a hornblower dinner cruise than a fight. Earlier I mentioned that Arthur Evans found tablets on Crete written in 2 different languages, although he didn't recognize even this basic fact about them. Since his day, much progress has been made in understanding these languages, however, and in fact, mostly due to the efforts of Michael Ventris, we know that Linear B, a sample of which you see here, is actually a primitive form of Greek. The Linear B tablets are, in fact, probably the earliest surviving examples of something written in an Indo-European language. Ventris was another of those prodigy linguists, like the more famous Champollion. He taught himself to read Egyptian hieroglyphics at the age of 8 and is said to have been able to repeat anything he'd ever read.
One of the currently most interesting archaeological sites on the Greek mainland, although not as famous as Mycenae, is at Pylos, near the west coast, 10 miles north of the town with the same name. Schliemann, despite the connection with Nestor in the Iliad, didn't go there, and it was not extensively investigated until the 1950s. The so-called Palace of Nestor has been uncovered along with many other artifacts, including hundreds of Linear B tablets. In 2015, near the palace ruins, the so-called Tomb of the Griffin Warrior was found, which contains some of the most impressive Mycenaean age artifacts ever found, including several small carved agates like this one, only 1.5 inches wide, along with several gold rings and other jewelry, many of which, like this piece, required an amazing amount of technical skill.
This is Mycenae now, which was excavated by Schliemann, who came here in 1876, a few years after his big success at Troy. The location of Mycenae was never a mystery in the way the location of Troy, say, or to some extent Knossos was. Everyone knew where and what it was, but no one had ever bothered to dig into it as thoroughly as Schliemann. He was little concerned about ordinary buildings, broken pots, things like that, and zeroed in on the area now called Grave Circle A at the lower left in his search for the tombs of the heroes of the Trojan War. We'll see what he found there in just a bit. The usual view is that the Linear B tablets Evans found on Crete were written by mainland conquerors of the island. They show up in Minoan archaeology from about 1450 on. It's hard to say exactly what the relationship between the mainland and Crete before this presumed invasion of the latter by the former was. Evans, because no tablets of any sort had been found on the mainland by the time he died, thought that the mainlanders were illiterate barbarians. We know that isn't altogether true, but it still may be that Crete had the more advanced civilization, artistically at least. The usual view now is that there was considerable Minoan influence on Mycenaean art. Mycenae occupies an even more central place in Greek mythology than Knossos. It is said to have been founded by Perseus, who was the offspring of Danae by Zeus, who appeared to her in a golden cloud. According to the usual mythological biography of Perseus, he was assigned by King Polydeuctes of Argos to kill Medusa. This monster had once been the most beautiful girl in Greece, but she made the mistake of letting herself be made love to in a temple dedicated to Athena. This made the goddess so angry that she vowed she would never be made love to again, and she made her so ugly, with the famous snakes for hair and so on, that anyone who looked at her would be turned to stone. To help Perseus against this monster she had made, Athena gave him a sword and a mirror. he was to use the mirror so that he could see Medusa without actually looking at her, although it's a bit difficult to picture how he could have maneuvered really so as to kill a monster in this fashion. Here you see a later Greek black-figured painting of the 6th century, vase painting. From this artist's viewpoint, it does seem that it took Perseus a while to master the needed technique, but eventually he did get the job done and cut off the ugly head as a present for Athena, who put it on her shield to paralyze her enemies now. It was to become, in fact, common practice for Greek soldiers to put replicas of this device on their shields as well. Perseus went on to many other adventures, including rescuing Andromeda and founding Tiryns that we'll see. Legend also says Pegasus sprang from the blood of Medusa. Pegasus, the famous winged horse Bellerophon rode to chase the Chimera with. Mycenae was also home to the family which is the most prominent in all of Greek mythology, the Atreides. The ancestor of this family was Pelops, after whom the Peloponnesus was named. The story goes that King Oenomaus promised to give his daughter and his land to anyone who could beat him in a chariot race. The catch was that if you challenged him and lost, you were killed. Pelops challenged him, but he took the precaution of bribing Oenomaus' charioteer Myrtilus to put out something less than his best effort. As a result, Pelops won and then took a second precaution. He pushed Myrtilus off a cliff to prevent him ever telling anyone about the bribe. Unfortunately for Pelops, however, as Myrtilus fell to his death, he put a curse on him and all of his descendants. The chariot race is supposed to have taken place at Olympia and to have been the inspiration for the Olympic Games. It's tempting to say something about bribery being an old Olympic tradition. In the distance now, you can see the Lion Gate, which was the main entrance to the city. Pelops had 2 sons, Atreus and Thyestes, who were the first to feel the effects of the curse. Thyestes had an affair with his brother's wife and was kicked out of town, so he found an illegitimate son of Atreus and persuaded him to kill his father. Atreus foiled this plot and then caught 2 of Thyestes' sons and cooked them up in a stew to serve to their father, all of which must have delighted the shade of Myrtilus. In this picture, you can get a good idea of how the style of stonework here compares to that at Knossos. Perseus is supposed to have needed the help of the Cyclopses to build this, while Knossos looks more like Sans Souci. Most of the stones out of which Knossos is built can be lifted by one man. Here they weigh tons. The little over the gateway tops 20 tons. If the distinction one is looking for is one between masculine and feminine, there's no doubt that Mycenae seems the more masculine place. Here's a still closer view of the Lion Gate. Agamemnon was the son of Atreus, and Aegisthus was the son of Thyestes. And with their stories, we get to material used by 2 of the greatest writers in history. Agamemnon is the leader of the Greeks in Homer's Iliad, and the story of how Aegisthus seduced Agamemnon's wife Clytemnestra while he was gone, and the consequences thereof, is the subject of the Oresteia trilogy of Aeschylus. It was once thought possible that because of certain superficial similarities between, for example, the Lion Gate and Stonehenge, there might have been some contact between Mycenae and Britain. It's now known, however, that Stonehenge is closer in age to the pyramids than to the Lion Gate. It's almost 1,000 years older than the Lion Gate, maybe even more than that. Here are the lions, as they're called, up closer. Whatever they are, we have here the oldest surviving large-scale sculpture ever found on the European mainland. If they are really lions, one has to wonder how their heads were squished into the spots apparently occupied by them. Conceivably, they projected out, which would also have made them easier to knock off, but I'm inclined to think the heads might have been those of griffins, like the ones which we saw painted a while ago on the walls of the throne room at Knossos. The Minoan-style column between them is certainly not inconsistent with this possibility either. The problem with this view is that they don't have wings, but I say it's better to have wingless griffins on your front door than pin-headed lions. Here's a view of the upper part of the citadel, which, like most of the rest of the ancient city, had to await the work of the more professional, if less romantic and famous archaeologists who followed Schliemann. The palace here, if it's even worthy to be called that, was far less extensive than the one at Knossos. One similarity that comes to mind, however, is the lack of any apparent large religious building, temple, shrine. Some think that the hearth scene here might have served some sort of religious purpose. But in this artist's view of what a similar building might have been like, the palace looks more like something on the order of the lobby of the Athens Hilton than a temple sanctuary. Indeed, this has to count as a very imaginative reconstruction. If it's at all accurate, however, the interior decoration, if not the architecture itself, did look very Minoan in style. Just how imaginative this reconstruction is can be judged from the fact that this is about the only large fragment of Mycenaean painting to survive. It does look Minoan, however, and the subject is apparently a woman who may even have snakes in her hand, although it's not certain what those snake-like things really are. It's hard to imagine a more typically Minoan subject than a woman with snakes in her hands. This is Grave Circle A, where in 1876 Heinrich Schliemann found 6 shaft graves with a total of 16 bodies buried in them. He, of course, leaped to the conclusion, on the basis of no real evidence whatever, that he had found the graves of Agamemnon and his family. We now know that the age for these graves predates the traditional date for the Trojan War by some 300 years. The burials were apparently made around 1500 BC. The walls, which include the grave circle, the walls of the city, along with the Lion Gate, were built around 1300, so they would have been familiar certainly to Agamemnon or whoever was in charge of this place at the time. The bodies Schliemann found are said to have been buried in a contracted position. They'd apparently not been burned. Considering the fact that Schliemann thought these were the bodies of the Trojan War heroes, I'm surprised he didn't pay more attention to the bodies themselves. I don't know where what's left of them is, or if they survive at all. Most of what Schliemann found buried with the dead is now on display in cases like these in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. The gold things stand out clearly enough. Most of the other things are made of bronze, which is partially oxidized. When Schliemann found the body wearing the gold mask seen at the top of the picture here, he thought he was looking at Agamemnon himself. Here you can see it up closer and more effectively lit. This mask is the most realistic and portrait-like of the several ones that were found. If this is Agamemnon, Hollywood should have gotten Kirk Douglas to play him instead of Ulysses. He could pass for this fellow in a minute. Agamemnon was the son of Atreus and brother to Menelaus, the king of Sparta, who was the husband of Helen, and Agamemnon's wife was Helen's sister Clytemnestra. This gold mask is just a little bit reminiscent of the sort of gold helmet found by Woolley at Ur from around the middle of the 3rd millennium, and then it also does remind one a bit of the gold mask of King Tut. King Tut's from a couple of hundred years earlier than this. What, if anything, is to be concluded from these resemblances, though, is uncertain. I should mention, too, that there are those who think that this is a forgery, and the Greek government has, so far, for various reasons, refused to allow metallurgical tests on this that just might prove to have gigantically embarrassing results. Schliemann was not above various kinds of chicanery, but it is hard to believe that this isn't the real thing. This so-called crown is too big to have been worn in the usual sense by a person, so it was perhaps part of some sort of grand, giant, purely ceremonial headdress, or else it might have been intended for a divinity or a statue thereof. To make sense now of what we'll hear next week about the Iliad, you need some further mythological background. In a way, the story begins with the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, to which all the gods except Eris, the goddess of discord, were invited. She showed up anyway, however, and tossed a golden ball inscribed, "To the fairest," in among the guests. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all claimed it and demanded Zeus decide among them. As someone has said, this put him in a position where he was going to have to make two of the women in his family angry and another one ungrateful. So to get out of this, he appointed Paris, the son of King Priam of Troy, to be the judge. He thought Paris was honest because once, when he'd been dressed up in his bull costume, Zeus, he had entered a sort of 4-H show in which Paris was a judge, and Paris had voted some other bull best in show. He'd voted against the king of the gods himself. Unfortunately, Paris wasn't in fact honest at all, though. The three goddesses all tried to bribe him, and Aphrodite won by offering him the most beautiful woman in the world. Exactly what this is isn't certain, but it was probably a mask too, though apparently not in this case bearing a portrait of the deceased. Unfortunately, the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Troy, was married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. With the aid of Aphrodite, however, Paris won her love, and they did flee then to Troy. When Menelaus found out about this, he came to Mycenae to get his brother Agamemnon, and they set out to collect some other heroes to go and get her back, and again avenge what was seen not as just a private wrong, but as an affront to Greeks as a whole. This is another of the masks Schliemann found. When they came to Ithaca to get the wily Odysseus, he had just become the father of Telemachus, and an oracle had told him that if he went to Troy, he wouldn't get back for 20 years. So to avoid this, he pretended to be crazy by apparently trying to plow a field with a donkey and an ox yoke together. The others put his infant son down in front of the plow, however, and he turned it aside, showing that he wasn't crazy after all, so he had to go.
Here are some of the weapons
Which were buried with the bodies Schliemann found. When they went to get Achilles, they faced another ruse. His mother had been told that he wouldn't come back from Troy at all, so she made him dress up like his sister, so the Greeks would think he wasn't home. It's a little disturbing to be told that the most feared of the Greek soldiers could be mistaken for a girl just because he put a dress on. That wouldn't be enough to disguise Mark Maguire. Anyway, Odysseus put a sword in among the gifts, which the Greeks had brought for Achilles' sisters, Barbie dolls, makeup kits, things like that, and he immediately knocked him out of the way and grabbed the sword, giving away his hitherto successful disguise, so he had to go too. Here's one of the knives up closer. They have hunting scenes on them of a sort which are non-existent in surviving Minoan art, but the style is nevertheless strongly reminiscent of Knossos. Although I don't think I pointed them out at the time, figure-8-shaped shields like the one in the center here are a common Minoan decorative motif, and the wasp-waisted figures of the hunters here also certainly recall the painting surviving at Knossos. This gold sword hilt is said to be of the same date as the thing Schliemann found at Mycenae, but it was actually found on the island of Skopelos. After the Greeks were all notified of what was happening, they agreed to assemble at Aulis, where a fleet sent by King Idomeneus of Crete would take them to Troy. While they were waiting at Aulis, Agamemnon accidentally killed a deer sacred to Artemis, and as a result she refused to give the Greek ships any wind until he agreed to sacrifice his own daughter Iphigenia to her. This made Iphigenia's mother, Clytemnestra, furious, the fact that Agamemnon would do this, and it gave her further motive to leave him for Aegisthus during the war. This rock crystal cup was found in grave circle B, some distance from the more famous circle A excavation. In the end, Artemis accepted Iphigenia as a priestess instead of as a sacrifice, but she was lost to her mother nevertheless. This story of Iphigenia has been retold many times since the classic version of Euripides was written. Racine and Goethe, for example, both used it. This was found in the ruins of a house near Circle A, and the date for it is some 300 years later than the things we've been seeing from the grave circle itself. That is, it is about the same date as the traditional date for the Trojan War. In the history of Greek art, these fellows are in fact the only human figures at all close to that date. So I guess we have to form our ideas of what Achilles and Odysseus, Agamemnon and Menelaus looked like from this. That's why I hate to show it. These guys don't look like they could fight their way off a clay pot. They look like skinny little hobos with giant noses wearing knee socks held up by garters. This is an important work of art, however. These are in fact the earliest human figures ever found painted on a Greek vase, and there aren't any more like them for hundreds of years, so they deserve some respect, homely as they are. This seal stone was also found at Mycenae, however, and this fellow comes much closer to my idea of what Achilles or Agamemnon would have looked like. Keep this in mind rather than that pot when you hear me talking about the Greeks next week. This is as good a place as any to mention that most Greek myths do not have authors in the usual sense. Most myths are anonymous in origin, and the versions we have are, in most cases, much later than the origins of the myths themselves. The first Greek mythographer who tells many of the best-known stories is Hesiod, who was almost as early as Homer himself. The Greek tragedians are another source, but many of the myths have come down to us in the versions of much later compilers like Apollodorus of Athens in the 2nd century BC or Ovid, the 1st century AD Roman author. The most comprehensive modern treatment of virtually all the important Greek myths is that of Robert Graves. You should be warned, however, that his work combines very valuable accounts of sources and versions with the most outrageous interpretations imaginable. In departing from Mycenae for the coast, whence they apparently would have gone by sea to Aulis, the Mycenaeans would have followed essentially the path of the modern tourist road, and in doing so they would have gone by the so-called Treasury of Atreus, which you can see in the distance with some buses parked nearby. This is the largest of 100 or so such tombs found throughout the area. The dates for these are perhaps 2 or 3 centuries later than the grave circles. If Agamemnon lived at the time of the traditional date for the Trojan War, and if Atreus was his father, then to associate Atreus with this is not unreasonable, despite the fact that whoever associated it with him originally, and it's been known as the Treasury of Atreus since antiquity, did so on the basis of no surviving evidence. As you can see in this picture, a sort of artificial hill has been created, and this has beneath it a stone-domed building that is one of the major accomplishments of Mycenaean architecture. Here you are now at the entrance to it. It may have contained something like a treasure at one time, but it was essentially apparently a multi-use tomb rather than a treasury per se. It has long since been robbed of everything that it once contained, including human remains. The facade was originally elaborately decorated and had an 18-foot-high column decorated with something very like the zigzag pattern found commonly in the Romanesque period in northern Europe to either side of the entrance. What's left of one of the columns has been set into a reconstruction in the Athens National Archaeological Museum, as you can see. The original parts are the darker patches to the left and right. Here you are now inside looking out. Above the doorway is one of the largest stones the Greeks ever used in a building. That lintel is about 30 feet wide and weighs 120 tons. It was rare for even the Egyptians to use that heavy a stone in their architecture. The interior is in the form of a conical corbelled dome some 50 feet wide and about 45 feet high, making it the largest dome before the Pantheon, which has the largest stone dome ever built. Since this is not, however, what is called a true dome, which is in effect the result of rotating a true arch, it lacks some elegance from an engineering perspective, but one can't argue with the results. Clumsy or not, it has stayed up for over 3,000 years and seems as stable as ever, despite the fact that what holds it up is a bit of a mystery to me. No mortar was used. Standing inside it, like standing in the shadow of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, makes one feel a little like Damocles must have felt with the sword suspended over his head. Why the people of Mycenae rather suddenly gave up the grave circle idea and began burying the important dead in these tholos or beehive tombs is something scholars still debate. Well, that's where we'll wind up this lecture, and next time we'll see how it all turns out for Achilles and Agamemnon and Menelaus and Helen of Troy. We'll hear about the Trojan War, among other things.